I almost missed Major William Brennan's letter because it was filed like a piece of routine trash. One creased envelope, addressed to Colonel James Harrington, tucked behind a stack of supply memos that smelled faintly of disinfectant. Brennan's handwriting was tight and impatient, like he'd been writing while someone waited for him to stop, and the only line he put in quotation marks was, "9 shadows on the film." He wasn't writing to me, and he wasn't trying to be dramatic. He was trying to get one specific man to act fast. What snagged me wasn't the story he hinted at, but the blank space he left on purpose. Enclosures listed, none present. If the X-rays and photos were missing, someone either misplaced them or decided they shouldn't travel with the rest of the record. I closed the folder, found the archivist's desk phone, and started dialing the county hospital to ask who had been chief of surgery in 1944, and where their old operative logs ended up. The door to Colonel James Harrington's office opened without a knock, cutting across a morning he had meant for quiet maintenance, requisitions, guard rosters, and a short entry in his commander's log that proved the camp was still orderly. Major William Brennan stepped in too fast, carrying a wet, dark-room envelope, a thin folder, and an X-ray film held by one corner as if it might stain the air. He placed the film on Harrington's desk with a flat slap. Harrington's first reaction was anger. A commander's office ran on permission, and Brennan had skipped it. The anger lasted only until Harrington looked at the film. The image showed a narrow ribcage and abdomen. Inside the pale shapes, 9 dark flecks sat like errors someone had forgotten to erase. Brennan's finger moved from one to the next, counting. The counting turned the picture from an oddity into an indictment, and Harrington felt his irritation convert into focus, because a count of 9 meant this was not a single accident with a single explanation. Brennan said the patient was a German prisoner brought in 2 days earlier, assessed at 16 during intake. He said the boy's name was Klaus Hoffmann, though the spelling might not be final because surrender paperwork was inconsistent. He said the boy carried shrapnel from 3 distinct injuries spread across roughly 9 months. He said there were no formal treatment records, no evidence of prior surgery, and clear signs of chronic infection. He added 2 photographs taken minutes before, scar tracks of different ages, an angry wound line near the hip that had never fully closed, a shoulder that had healed wrong. The result was that the X-ray stopped being medical curiosity and became a pattern. The cost was that the pattern implied prolonged neglect, and neglect implied questions bigger than anatomy. Harrington asked how Brennan knew it was 3 separate events instead of one catastrophic moment. Brennan answered with medicine, the way older scars had hardened and pulled, the way newer tracks still wept, the difference between healed tissue and tissue that never properly closed, the pockets of infection that suggested repeated neglect rather than a single failure. He cited the boy's brief triage account, taken while the boy shook with fever and could barely keep his eyes open. The result was that the injuries became a timeline. The cost was that once a timeline existed, the camp could not pretend this was only a sick prisoner and nothing more. Harrington asked the question that mattered inside a camp. What happens if they do nothing? Brennan said infection was advancing, and the boy was near sepsis. Without surgery to remove or at least reduce the sources of infection, the boy would likely worsen quickly. The camp infirmary could stabilize him briefly, but it could not undo months of damage with bandages and encouragement. The result was that inaction was no longer neutral. The cost was that action would consume scarce resources and could still fail loudly. Harrington's mind moved through obligations like a checklist. Prisoner medical care was mandated, so was documentation. If the boy died untreated, it would be a death in Harrington's custody, and the record would be clear enough for anyone who wanted to hurt Harrington to use it. If the boy lived, the medical history could become evidence that traveled beyond the camp into intelligence channels, and evidence had a way of attracting attention. Harrington understood he was being forced to choose between 2 risks, the visible risk of operating and the slower risk of letting the boy die and defending it afterward. He asked why Brennan had come directly to him instead of up the medical chain. Brennan said the chain would consume hours the boy did not have. He said he had already heard a corporal in the corridor refer to the boy as already dead, as if the label were convenient. Brennan did not trust convenience in medicine. The result was that Brennan framed the breach as a time intervention. The cost was that Harrington now had to decide whether to reward a violation of protocol for a morally persuasive reason, and that decision would teach the camp what mattered more, order or outcomes. Harrington called in his aide and gave 3 orders that would shift the case from rumor to record. First, verify the intake entry and age assessment in the prisoner registry and note the method used. Second, duplicate the X-ray and photographs, number them, and place them under controlled custody in the camp's administrative safe. Third, draft a memorandum stating that the commander had ordered preservation of medical materials for a special case review. The result was immediate control of the evidence. The cost was that Harrington's name attached itself to the case at the first official step, making it harder to retreat later without looking like concealment. The aide returned with the intake sheet and a short note from the intake medic. The age assessment was not guesswork. It was based on physical exam, dental condition, and the prisoner's own statement, with the caveat that documents from the surrender point were incomplete. Harrington accepted the uncertainty and ordered it recorded as uncertainty. A precise lie would be worse than an honest estimate. The result was a defensible baseline. The cost was that uncertainty would invite future challenges from anyone who wanted to argue the boy was older and therefore less politically sensitive. Brennan said he would accept discipline after the fact if needed, but he wanted a senior surgical assessment immediately and the option of outside assistance. Harrington ordered Brennan to convene the camp's most experienced surgical staff and return within 20 minutes with a blunt estimate and a recommendation. Operate here, transport out, or document the decline and accept the outcome. The action accelerated decision. The cost was that it moved this medical problem into Harrington's schedule and pushed routine camp management aside. While Brennan gathered the consult, Harrington looked again at the film. He had seen X-rays before. He had never seen one that looked like an inventory of neglect. He tried to keep his thinking practical, because practical thinking was safer than moral thinking in wartime and easier to defend in reports. Still, the phrase underage prisoner kept returning. A 16-year-old soldier was not a slogan. It was a fact with a weight that changed the geometry of duty. The consult arrived with Brennan and 2 medical officers who wore exhaustion-like uniform. The senior military surgeon stated the case was high risk. The boy was septic or close to it, fragment placement was uncertain, and the camp's equipment and anesthesia support were limited. Survival with controlled infection might be under 50%. Without operative intervention, the likely trajectory was deterioration and death, perhaps within a day or 2. The result was professional confirmation of Brennan's alarm. The cost was that under 50% moved the decision from medical to administrative, because Harrington would be held responsible not only for trying, but for the outcome. Harrington asked what would raise the odds. The surgeon said either transport to a better facility or bringing in an outside surgeon with better tools and experience. Transport would cost time and might kill the boy on the road. Bringing a civilian surgeon to the camp could preserve time while adding capability, but it would bring outside visibility and create an independent set of notes outside military control. The result was a workable option. The cost was that the option expanded the circle of stakeholders, and wider circles are harder to manage. Harrington chose time. He picked up his telephone and called the nearest town hospital, requesting the chief of surgery on an urgent line. When the surgeon came on, Harrington described the case in plain terms. An underage prisoner with multiple untreated fragment injuries and severe infection requiring immediate operative care beyond the camp's routine capacity. He asked for assistance on site and offered military transport for the surgeon and nurse. The town surgeon hesitated and asked why the army could not handle its own patient. Harrington said the army could attempt it, but the boy was likely to die, and Harrington was not willing to accept a predictable death when a better chance existed. He said the age out loud because it was relevant and because it mattered. The pause on the line changed. The surgeon agreed to come with a nurse and whatever sterile supplies they could spare, but warned that his hospital was thinly staffed and that taking him away would harm local care. The result was outside help on the way. The cost was borrowed capacity from civilians who were already stretched. and Harrington could not claim that cost belonged to someone else. Harrington then called his division medical office. He reported a special case involving an underage prisoner with severe untreated injuries and requested authorization for civilian assistance. He kept the report factual and timed. He asked for a return call acknowledging the request and wrote down the name of the officer who received it. The result was procedural cover. The cost was a signal flare up the chain of command that could bring inspectors, questions, and people who cared more about optics than a boy's pulse. He ordered the infirmary to prepare the operating space and to isolate the patient to the extent the camp could manage. He also ordered limited traffic in and out of the medical area. He did not phrase it as secrecy. He phrased it as infection control and operational order. The result was a controlled environment. The cost was that restriction in a camp is noticed, and noticed restrictions become stories that spread faster than accurate information. Before the civilian surgeon arrived, Harrington required one more piece of the record, a minimal statement from the patient that would not delay care. He instructed Brennan to record a short timeline of injuries and the absence of treatment, date and time stamped, and to stop immediately if the boy destabilized. Brennan objected that questioning could stress a septic patient. Harrington narrowed the scope to 3 questions and required Brennan's presence to prevent the interview from becoming coercion. The result was a compromise between urgency and evidentiary discipline. The cost was additional strain on a boy who had little capacity left. The statement arrived in Brennan's hurried handwriting. It listed 3 injuries by circumstance, not by calendar date. Fragments from artillery, injury from a vehicle explosion, gunfire during a retreat. It said there had been no surgeon in between, only rags for dressings, little pain control, and orders to keep moving. It did not prove anything by itself. It did bind medical evidence to a coherent narrative. Harrington filed it with the numbered materials and understood that the case had crossed the line from internal sick call to something that might outlive the camp. The civilian surgeon arrived that afternoon and was escorted through the gate with a temporary badge clipped to his coat. Harrington met him briefly, showed the film and photographs, and asked for an assessment. The surgeon's response was controlled and immediate. The case was severe, infection was dangerous, and delay would narrow options further. He agreed to operate with Brennan's team, but he insisted on clear division of roles and on preserving removed fragments as labeled medical specimens rather than as loose objects in a tray. The result was a competent plan with standards. The cost was that standards require time, and time was the currency the boy could not afford. The operating room was prepared with boiled instruments, scrubbed cloth, and limited drugs and antiseptics. Harrington walked the perimeter once, not to supervise technique, but to confirm that his orders had translated into real readiness, clean surfaces, instrument count, lighting, and a plan for post-operative isolation. He then returned to his office because he understood his value here was authorization and documentation, not physical presence. He signed the surgical authorization in full. He attached the consult note. He noted the civilian assistance. He required that all removed fragments be labeled, bagged, and preserved under custody. He required a structured operative summary by morning, including any change from plan and the reason. The result was execution. The cost was that his signature transformed medical risk into command responsibility, and responsibility would be judged by outcome regardless of intent. The procedure began. Harrington did not hover outside the door. He requested updates only at major intervals, and he required each update be written down by the runner who brought it. The updates were short: anesthesia stable, incision begun, first fragments located, debridement underway, bleeding controlled. Each update meant progress, each also meant time, and time meant the boy's body absorbing more insult. Midway through, the civilian surgeon requested additional sterile cloth and stronger light. Harrington diverted supplies from storage and reassigned a lamp from another room. He also ordered his aide to keep a running list of what was diverted and from where. The action increased the team's ability to work cleanly. The cost landed elsewhere. Other patients would have fewer supplies and delayed procedures, and Harrington would have to justify why one prisoner had consumed resources that could have been spread. He did not try to justify it with speeches. Instead, he issued a terse directive to the infirmary. Non-critical cases would be rescheduled, and the reason would be recorded as emergency surgery under duty of care. The result was a controlled narrative inside the camp. The cost was resentment, because some of his own men believed that any extra effort for an enemy was misplaced effort for friends. Near the 4th hour, Brennan sent word that several fragments had been removed and infected tissue cleared, but additional metal lay close to structures that made every movement hazardous. Harrington understood the translation. One slip could bleed the boy out. A cautious hand could lose him to infection. Harrington drafted a log entry in neutral language, capturing only what could be defended, an emergency operation with outside assistance, undertaken due to severe untreated injuries and critical condition. The result was documentation in real time. The cost was that he was now narrating a risk that might end with a corpse. After roughly 5 hours, Brennan returned to the office with exhaustion visible in his posture. He reported that the surgery was technically successful. The most dangerous fragments were removed and the worst infected pockets addressed. The boy was critically weak and required strict monitoring. Harrington ordered immediate post-operative isolation and required Brennan to document any intraoperative changes from plan and the reasons. He requested the civilian surgeon's independent notes be duplicated and sealed in the same file. The result was a complete first draft of the medical record. The cost was that the record made the case harder to minimize, because thoroughness creates permanence. Night did not settle the matter. Close to midnight, a runner arrived with a written message: high fever, sudden heart rate drop, suspected shock, and uncontrolled infection. The camp's thin line between successful operation and death after intervention was being tested, and it was being tested on the very person Harrington had gambled for. Harrington went to the medical area and stopped outside the ward. He watched Brennan and the nurses move with practiced urgency, administering the limited measures available: fluids, warming, careful monitoring, and cautious use of the drugs they had. He did not interfere. He asked only for facts: blood pressure trend, temperature trend, and whether the boy was conscious enough to respond to touch. Brennan stepped out and said plainly that the boy could still die despite everything. The result was clarity without comfort. The cost was that Harrington could see his decision turning into a slow crisis instead of a clean rescue. The crisis forced a second set of decisions. Harrington authorized additional staff to be pulled from routine duties and ordered 2 non-critical cases delayed to free hands and supplies. He issued a brief internal directive emphasizing that prisoner treatment was a legal obligation and that staff rotations would be enforced to prevent collapse. The action concentrated resources where they might save the boy. The cost was distributed across the camp, and distributed costs create quiet hostility. As the night dragged on, Harrington received 2 updates. The first was negative: fever still high, heart rate unstable, oxygenation poor. The second, near dawn, was cautiously positive: temperature down by a small margin, heart rate trending towards steadier rhythm, skin color improving. Brennan reported the shock appeared to be passing, though infection remained a threat. The result was survival for another day. The cost was depletion, exhausted staff, supplies consumed, and a camp schedule disrupted in ways Harrington would need to repair. Harrington returned to his office and added to his log with specificity: time of crisis, measures taken, staff reassigned, cases delayed, and the reasoning tied to duty of care. He wrote it because he understood how easy it would be for someone later to claim he had panicked or improvised. Specificity was not sentiment, it was armor. The cost of armor was that it made every action look deliberate, and deliberate actions are easier to prosecute if the outcome turns ugly. By the second evening, Brennan reported steady improvement, reduced temperature, more stable vitals, and signs that infection was receding. The boy was still fragile, but survival had become plausible. Plausible survival created a new problem. A living patient could speak. A living patient could become evidence. The case was no longer only medical, it was procedural and political, and Harrington could already feel the system leaning toward the story it wanted to tell. Captain Leonard Moss, an intelligence officer, arrived the next morning with the neutral expression of a man who turned events into usable information. He requested access to medical records, preserved fragments, and the patient for interview as soon as the attending physician deemed it permissible. Harrington granted access and presented the custody log and numbered materials. He also set conditions: short sessions only, Brennan present, and questions focused on factual timeline rather than ideology. The result was cooperation without surrendering control. The cost was that Harrington had to manage Moss as carefully as he managed prisoners, because Moss's purpose was not care, but extraction. Moss accepted the conditions but demanded a complete copy of the medical file and the civilian surgeon's notes. Harrington provided them, kept a duplicate in camp custody, and recorded the transfer with signatures and timestamps. He did it because he trusted paper more than goodwill. The result was continued control of chain. The cost was administrative labor and the acknowledgement that his camp was now part of a larger machine that would judge his paperwork as much as his decisions. Harrington did not enter the interview room. He waited outside because he understood the limits of his role and the danger of turning the boy's testimony into a performance for command. He listened only for cadence, not content, and he watched Brennan step in and out as the boy's condition required breaks. The result was restraint. The cost was dependence on others' phrasing, and phrasing can change meaning without changing facts. When Moss emerged, he summarized the essentials in crisp lines. The boy described repeated wounds, denial of treatment, and orders to return to duty. He described German rear area collapse, field discipline that punished those who slowed down, and the expectation that a wounded boy should keep walking until he failed. He also described a retreat in which an officer fired on men who tried to surrender. Moss identified which parts were direct observation and which were second-hand, and he marked the distinction. The result was a reportable statement that could be checked against medical findings. The cost was that the statement, once written, would demand a response somewhere above Harrington's authority. Harrington asked Moss whether he would separate narrative from analysis. Moss said intelligence reports were not court documents. Harrington replied that they still ended up in hands that treated them like court documents when convenient. He requested the report be divided into a factual narrative tied to medical corroboration and a separate analytic section. Moss hesitated, then agreed, and asked why Harrington cared. Harrington answered with procedure. If analysis and fact were mixed, any dispute over interpretation would infect the facts, and infected facts were harder to defend. The result was a cleaner document structure. The cost was that Harrington had inserted himself into intelligence method, which could be read as interference if someone disliked him. The civilian surgeon submitted an operative summary in plain language, confirming multiple foreign bodies removed, extensive infection, and evidence of old, inadequately healed injury. Harrington attached it as independent corroboration and filed it under the same numbering system. The file now contained 3 aligned strands: imaging, operative findings, and a patient timeline. The result was coherence. The cost was gravity. A coherent file is hard to dismiss, and hard to dismiss files attract review from people who were not present and would not care about the limits Harrington faced. Division Medical Office called with a warning disguised as routine guidance. Special cases trigger inspections, and inspections evaluate the camp's general handling of prisoners. The call did not accuse Harrington. It reminded him that attention rarely stays focused on a single incident. Harrington responded with practical action. He ordered a rapid internal review of recent prisoner medical documentation, emphasizing completeness, consistent signatures, and clear justifications for delays. The result was readiness. The cost was time, tension, and the risk of finding small errors that could be inflated into large failures under scrutiny. As Hoffmann stabilized, Brennan recommended transfer to a specialized long-term facility in Texas. Harrington agreed. Keeping the boy in camp increased risk, relapse, security complications, and the appearance that Harrington was holding a witness. Transfer reduced exposure while maintaining duty of care. The result was a clean next step. The cost was loss of control. Once the boy left, Harrington might never know the ending, and he would have to accept that ignorance. Harrington signed the transfer approval with medical justification and a note authorizing continued access for investigators under proper procedures. He attached the numbered evidence list and a transfer receipt template so material integrity could be checked after transfer. The result was continuity. The cost was that Harrington had built a record robust enough to survive without him, which meant the record could also survive to be used against him if someone chose to frame the story differently. On the morning of transfer, Harrington stood near the gate while the ambulance truck idled. Nurses secured the boy on the stretcher. Brennan checked bandages one last time and handed over a written summary for the receiving facility. Harrington did not speak to the boy. He watched the truck leave because any words he offered would have served his own conscience more than the boy's condition. The result was restraint. The cost was the absence of comfort, because commanders like to believe closure is something they can grant. That night, Harrington completed the log entry in the only language his job allowed: decision, authorization, operative summary received, post-operative crisis, stabilization, transfer, and materials forwarded to intelligence channels with receipt. He listed attachment numbers, signatures, and times. The result was a closed administrative loop. The cost was that the loop could not contain what had driven it. The instant he saw 9 fragments inside a child's body and understood that the child's survival was also a burden of proof. In the following weeks, Harrington received brief acknowledgements that the materials had been received and that further inquiries might follow. The messages contained no praise and no condemnation. They confirmed only that a file now existed beyond his camp. Harrington understood what that meant. His decision might never become a public case. It might become a folder pulled years later because someone needed one more corroborated example. If that day came, his name would be there in ink, attached to the moment he chose action over an easy death and accepted whatever the record would do with him afterward.